Today we're chatting with Brett Leonard, the writer and director of the cult film The Lawnmower Man. So let's get to it. You are listening to the How to Create VR podcast, weekly conversations with VR and AR professional creators, designers, and producers. Hello and welcome to another episode of the How to Create VR podcast, where I speak with professional creators, designers, developers, and producers who work on VR, AR, and MR projects. I'm Marcelo, a VR evangelist and the guy behind howtocreatevr.com. My guest is Brett Leonard, the writer and director of the film The Lawnmower Man. Today, Brett and I will be chatting all about his movie, his vision of VR then, and how it changed today. But before we get started, I want to remind you to register at howtocreatevr.com. It's free and registration gives you access to all of our tutorials, podcast interviews, and more. Just visit howtocreatevr.com and click on the register for free button. All right, Brett, welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
You're the guy that did The Lawnmower Man. So let's just start with that. What inspired you to do that movie?
I moved in my early 20s to a place called Santa Cruz, California to pursue my dreams of being a film director. And I, of course, love sci-fi. I make movies because I saw 2001: A Space Odyssey when I was 7 years old. And that was a very immersive experience, actually, sitting in the front row of that movie in the 70mm Super Panavision format. So I met a bunch of people when I landed in Santa Cruz, including people like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak and a man named Jaron Lanier, who actually coined the term virtual reality. He had the first sort of consumer-facing VR company called VPL. It was in the late 80s that he founded that. He introduced me to VR, and I just saw it as an amazing cinematic opportunity to show something that I believe was going to be changing the nature of computing, changing the nature of media itself. And I saw it coming much faster than it ended up coming at us, but it was something that very much inspired me. So I worked it into the story of The Lawnmower Man, which actually was initially based on a short story by Stephen King. That short story only had a guy being chased by a telekinetically controlled lawnmower for 7 pages. The whole rest of it with VR and all that we created from whole cloth. I used basically Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as a template for the story with a little bit of Flowers for Algernon mixed in, and through the use of nootropic drugs and VR stimulating a human being to become something beyond human, to become transhuman. You know, people have talked about it as the first film in which a human becomes data. It came out of the fact I landed in the place I landed when I was very young.
So you said you wrote VR into it. I know it's based on the Stephen King book, but when you originally wrote the screenplay, was it a different version and then you discovered VR and then you wrote it into it? Or you wrote VR into it from the beginning because of your experience?
Yeah, I wrote VR into it from the beginning. I was given this short story. I wanted to make something with VR in it because I knew it was a new concept, and I thought I could do something as the first film to really introduce that concept and that term. And so I worked it in from the very beginning of the project, although the project did start as a 7-page short story by Stephen King that had nothing to do with VR.
Was this your first movie you wrote?
This is my second feature film. I had a film called The Dead Pit. Before this, it was a zombie movie I made for about $300,000, and it did very well in the world marketplace as a zombie movie. And that caught the attention of the producers and financiers of The Lawnmower Man. And when they came to me, their initial concept was to have a serial killer in a small town who was chopping up women for fertilizer. I rejected that concept.
Good call.
And I said, well, I've got this other thing that I really would like to work in. I actually ended up making a 20-minute educational video about VR to educate the producers and financiers on what the medium was and what was happening. They didn't really understand it, but they thought it was exciting. And they kind of let me have my creative head, so to speak. And, you know, the rest is history. It was a very unique thing. It's funny. I think in the current modality of the film business, it would be very difficult to make an original film like The Lawnmower Man now.
Why do you say that?
Oh, just the nature of how feature films are financed now, what's happening in the independent market, the tremendous disruption. It could probably be financed at a Netflix or an Amazon or now an Apple, probably much more than it would as an independent feature.
I see. And you said you made an educational film about VR. I was going to ask you, how is it that you convinced people to give you money? What was the budget on this film? Because, I mean, if you look at it, it seems like you had a pretty good budget, especially for your special effects.
We didn't. The trick of this movie was, and this actually became sort of the bellwether of my entire career, which is I could do more for less. was sort of a blessing and a curse. But
Right.
It ended up being a $5 million film, which at that time with this level of digital effects, it was, one of the first phase of digital effects in feature film. And so that aspect of it, we had to be very clever. I went out and found very talented effects artists and companies, Angel Studios, who did a lot of the Cyberjobe effects, and Chaos Images, which then became Chaos Software, because a lot of the things they came up with for the Lawnmower Man turned into software like Pandemonium and these image processing softwares that became their business. So it was a very unique blend of people and smaller entrepreneurial companies that I brought together. My partner, Jamil Never, and I, who also co-wrote this with me and produced it, she's passed on now. We actually were the effects supervisors on the film, as well as me being the director and her being the producer. So it was a very unique thing to actually produce this film at that time. There wasn't a commoditized system for computer graphic effects at that time. We had to be very clever.
So what was it like directing the movie? And what I mean by that is it's about VR. How much explaining did you have to do to like Jeff Fahey or Pierce Bronson on what VR is and what the words they're speaking, what does that mean to them?
Well, both Jeff and Pierce are very serious actors, and they wanted to know everything. And they were very, very captivated by what VR really was. And in the film, we ended up using a tremendous amount of actual VR gear from Jaron Lanier's company and from other companies. That was the actual VR gear. Then the more fanciful VR gear, which kind of looks like what today's VR gear is, was coming from the production designer, Alex McDowell, and his team. Alex went on to be the production designer on Minority Report for Steven Spielberg and many other big films. The Lawnmower Man was his first film as production designer. So I think in some ways it set the tone for a lot of the things I'm seeing happening in the hardware world in VR, because a lot of it looks like it comes out of the Lawnmower Man. So there's even like these, sort of flatbed rotation devices where you lay down on your stomach and you go through a video game in VR. That's actually in the film.
It is, right.
And so I just constantly see things that come out of some of the ideas in the film, which is quite fun, 25 years on.
That scene where they're laying with their stomach down, that reminds me of that bird experience that you can do today where
Exactly.
You know
exactly
what I'm talking about. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly right. Yeah. And, and some of the questions around VR, which the film posits, are the same questions we're grappling with today. For me, it was an amazing time for me. It established me as, a major director because it was a very successful independent film. Even though it cost only $5 million, it made it over $200 million worldwide in all markets. It was the number one independent film of that year and one of the top 25 in history in terms of profitability. It really established me, and also established me being connected to two things: the term VR and the term lawnmower, which is
what a combination.
Kind of ironic and strange. Yeah, it's funny that term has come to sort of be connected to VR in any way. It's just one of the cosmic jokes of God.
Let's talk about the 90s and VR. What was VR like in the 90s, and how does it compare to today? I mean, you've been through it, right? I mean, you're the guy that made the Lawnmower Man, so you know what it was like. You were there at the beginning, or close to the beginning, right? I can go back to the 60s where they were doing it, but I mean, truly the 90s was where they were trying to have a rebirth. What's the difference? If you watch your movie, the headsets don't look that much different than they do today.
It's true, and it's an interesting experience for me. I'm kind of walking into the movie I made 26 years ago.
It's got to be pretty surreal.
It is a little surreal. And ironic, too, because the whole film was very much a cautionary tale about VR. So there's some irony there as well. In a word, in the 90s, VR was painful. It was very small poly count. It was a lot of transport latency that made reactiveness and interactivity very difficult. It was a low-res environment, and you could just sort of imagine the potential of it. And then what I tried to show in the film with state-of-the-art computer graphics at that time was what the potential would be. I thought that the industry would move much faster than it did, but we need to go through a few things like the adoption of broadband and smart devices and all kinds of things before we even got to this new phase in VR. As you know, there's been many beginnings to VR that go back to the 60s.
Right.
The Tom Furness Smart Cockpit project that happened, I believe, in the 70s. These kinds of things, there's been many different progenitors of virtual reality that go back quite a ways. It's a very interesting moment where we're seeing a true confluence and, as we said in the 90s, convergence of all these technologies and expertise sets that are allowing us to have true virtual experience.
Well, what's interesting is a lot of the virtual reality experiences that you were portraying in the movie were kind of psychedelic as opposed to photorealistic, like what we're trying to do today, right, with volumetric video and things like that. Was that on purpose for the point of storytelling, or was that how you thought VR was going to be used back then?
Just two things. One, it was budget. Again, it was actually a very low budget film, but at that time, those kinds of effects were actually cutting edge. And we were also, for me, me playing with something what I call cyberdelia. It's a cyberdelic experience. And for me, it's embracing what was unique about computer graphic effects to create a fantastical world as opposed to something that's photorealistic. I've done a lot of photorealistic work since then that has its place, but I also believe that the imagination can go well beyond photorealism, especially with current technology and digital imaging now. I'm still very interested in creating much more imaginative worlds in virtual reality than just photorealistic worlds.
So why are you such a believer of VR? What is it that attracts you to VR? Because you're continuing to do that, and we're going to talk about your current project that you're working on. But what is it about VR that really makes you a believer? And you've been doing this for 30 years?
It's really just in the advancement of storytelling, or story worlding, as I now call it. For me, being a student of cinema history and art history and looking at technology in terms of the evolution of technological connection to the human psyche and to the human body, transhumanism writ large, all those things are very interesting to me as a storyteller first. So I've always been interested as a storyteller and sort of a person who likes to play around with the mythology, the sort of the mythopoetic nature of the confluence of technology and the human being. That probably comes because I'm a Kubrickian, and it goes back to 2001: A Space Odyssey. Many things do with me. But it's also just that I see a very, very powerful medium that is absolutely coming. The foundation of this is the overall trend of spatial computing. And that's going to touch every vertical in our lives and every vertical that computing touches. And virtual experience, as I call it, I don't even call it VR anymore. I call it VX, virtual experience, which is all the R's, VR, AR, MR, all the R's, all the ways of delivering virtual experience to human beings is something I think needs to be created from a place of responsibility, also from an ethical framework, because this is a very powerful medium that changes your mind. It hardwires neuronic pathways to a much greater degree than almost any other medium ever created. So the stakes are high. And I think that for me, I started as a cautionary tale in this medium. So it's not that I've been, hey, let's go jump into VR. It's been, this is happening. It's very exciting. It's a tremendous expansion of human imagination and human experience. And yet there are a lot of issues this brings up that we really need to be careful with. And I think that that's, at the core of a lot of the stories I have to tell around this medium.
But at the same time, you're very passionate about it, and you're not saying we shouldn't do it. We just have to be cautious about it. That's all.
Exactly. We have to have a little bit of platonic responsibility as creators, especially in this nascent phase where we're really starting to get efficacy in the medium.
Well, let's talk about a couple of things that just came up in the news. For example, Vive announced eye tracking. Yes. They announced lip tracking. We're basically going to hook up the entire human brain into VR, ultimately. I mean, it seems like we're headed that way.
That is correct. It's going to happen.
It's going to happen. Right. So the question to you is, because you mentioned about it's a cautionary tale.
Yes.
Do you have any concerns? And where I'm going with that is more like privacy concerns and addiction concerns about VR, when we're completely hooked into it.
I have tremendous concerns about all the points you just mentioned. I think it's very important that we don't go into our own little solipsistic worlds where, like a cyberjob says, I'm God in here. That's one of the big lines from Lawnmower Man. I think that we can have a godlike experience in virtual reality, but we need to temper it with humanism, and we need to connect people, not separate them. And many of the things that have happened with social media and with smart devices has actually separated people. There's been a lot of negative psychological effects that can be greatly exacerbated in virtual reality. So I think it's important to put that context into the initial storytelling and the initial content that we create. We need to create a positive ritual around virtual experience. I think even cinema is a tremendously powerful medium, and there was a ritual that was created around going into the cinema and being there, and there's all kinds of sub-rituals there, and the lights dim, and we all go into this collective dream state, in a sense. That's even much, much greater and more intimate an experience in virtual experience. So it's important for us as creators and people that are trying to push the medium forward to really consider that in what we're doing. And what is the raison d'etre of the medium? I believe the raison d'etre is to awaken what I call the global human, to actually connect people in a way that allows human imagination to play on a level that's almost never been imagined before.
So how do we make this more social? Because, and I personally love VR, obviously, and I'm a huge evangelist of VR. But when I put on the headset, I'm gone.
Yeah.
Even at home, I'm completely gone. This isn't an experience, like you said, going to the movies where we're all together, even though it's dark. We're all together. You can feel the energy. If everybody's laughing, it's a different kind of vibe. How do we make VR that?
Well, many of the projects I'm working on are all about that. I believe we have to activate a community aspect, a group mind or GVX, group virtual experience, that doesn't just solely exist in the context of HUDs. We need to be able to have virtual environments that really incorporate that kind of socialization right from the beginning of the medium. That doesn't mean that you won't have people that are going into full immersion. This is people I call homo virtualis. They're just going to put on a data suit. They're going to put on touch tech. They're going to do everything to jump into a virtual world and be as immersed as possible. That's a certain percentage, small percentage of people at this point. Then there's many, many other people that will look into that world and see what people are doing in it and interact to a certain level. That's sort of the next shell of interaction outside of full immersion. And then there's just the voyeurism to the virtual world as a show, as something that, will be fascinating for people. And if you look at the success of Twitch, people watching people play video games, which is something I would have never thought would work. It's one of the biggest phenomenons on the internet.
It's huge, yeah.
Yeah, so I think we have to consider all these multiple shells of interaction when we're talking about virtual experience and not just totally focus on full immersion. Full immersion is still part of it. And I, am a person that likes to go into full immersion, but I don't think it's for everyone. And I think it's going to be a while as that ritual sort of establishes itself in the context of the socialization of virtual experience.
Well, and I think there is a time for full immersion, especially if you're just playing by yourself. But then I think also of a party. And in a party, you can play games together or watch TV together. I would love to do the same thing with virtual reality, is not just people watch me wear the HMD and make fun of me as I'm making these crazy moves, but also be involved both outside and inside so we can all be together. And that to me would be a fantastic social experience.
Exactly right. It's blending of those things. I mean, really, mixed reality is a great term that I think is going to be the first crashing wave front of the medium really attaining mass market adoption. It's not going to be just full immersion for everybody right off the bat. And, incorporating things like theatrical experience and concert experience and all of these types of group hive mind connective experiences within the context of virtual reality, being a part of that is very fascinating to me. And it's so wide open for experimentation because we're at the beginning. So it's very exciting from the context of invention.
Right. Well, let's switch into that because, you started by making a movie about VR. Now you're making movies in VR, and I want to talk a little bit about that. But before I switched into that, what's your favorite VR movie outside of The Lawnmower Man?
Well, I actually made two movies about VR,
right.
Lawnmower Man and then Virtuosity with Denzel Washington and Russell Crowe, which is actually another cautionary tale about AI character behavior, which is one of the things that are Sid 6.7 was the character that Russell Crowe played, and he was an amalgam of 295 serial killer psychologies and put into an AI that then got out of the machine through nanotechnologies.
And what year was that?
That was 95.
That's amazing. You truly are a man ahead of your time. Look at where we are today, VR and AI.
It's a blessing and a curse. But, that film has gotten a lot more prescient as time has gone on as well. But
sure.
The films that were really my inspirations, Douglas Trumbull's Brainstorm, which was, showed HUDs. It was not virtual reality per se. It was about recording brain experience and then having a full immersive experience of that. It never mentioned the term virtual reality. It wasn't about VR like The Lawnmower Man was, but it absolutely inspired me in many of the things I did in The Lawnmower Man. The other one, of course, even before that was Tron, which was going inside a computer. It wasn't, a virtual reality. It was literally a computer as the mise en scène, as the environment. But, those two films were very seminal for me. And then David Cronenberg's Existence, which happened after The Lawnmower Man, is a very interesting film. I love Cronenberg, his dark view of things. He's a wonderful filmmaker. And then there's been touches of it in many other films as well. But, it's rare that there's a film that really encapsulates all of these concerns that I've been dealing with in a couple of films I made. So it's a unique thing. Obviously, The Matrix is virtual reality. I got to know the Wachowskis, and they're great. And what they did was amazing. They even acknowledged sort of the antecedent of The Lawnmower Man to their process. So I thought they just knocked it out of the park in the first film, especially.
Completely.
So that is probably my favorite of all of the films that have dealt with virtual experience.
And my company is called Red Pill, Blue Pill Studios.
Yes. Great.
So anyway, right? You're making VR movies now. And it's actually a hybrid, which is interesting. I want you to explain what you're doing and what do you mean by a hybrid?
Cinema is one of my religions, and I love cinematic storytelling, and I love cinematic language in all of its forms in global cinema. And I'm also a student of global cinema. So I didn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater when I got into storytelling in the context of virtual experience. One of the first things I've done is I've shot a feature film called Hollywood Rooftop that is filmed in both 360 VR and in 2D cinema simultaneously. So I actually shot matching elements of the same feature film in both mediums, and I'm bringing them together in what I call Cinema VX, Cinema Virtual Experience. And I'm utilizing screens and the matrixing of screens and all of that within the immersive mise-en-scène of a character drama that's all about dialogue and character and story, which very few people do in this medium. And I wanted to come at it from the true indie sensibility. I was thinking, what would John Cassavetes or Robert Altman do if they had a 360 VR camera? And they get an ensemble of characters and they surround this camera with that drama and that character emotion. That's what we did with Hollywood Rooftop. I am currently in post on that and blending the two things together. We just did a sneak peek of one of my 12-minute, what I call frags of the film, because it's a feature film in fragments. You can't watch the whole thing in VR at the same time. We did a sneak peek at South by Southwest, and it was tremendous. It was a fantastic reception, and it really allowed people to be engaged in the story using cinematic language and using immersive language simultaneously. And, you know, it's just doing that experimentation. I did this film at a micro budget. Seek VR, the company that's forming the Netflix of VR, led by a woman named Mary Spio. They've been doing a lot of stuff in the music area with Lady Gaga and Katy Perry and artists like that with Universal Music. This is the film they've supported in the context of dramatic experimentation. And it's been a phenomenal experience. It's just shooting it in both mediums was wild.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, because what intrigues me is we have a language for 2D flat, whatever you want to call it, cinema.
Yes, flatties.
Flatties. Okay, we have a language. We have a cinema language for that,
yes.
Right? There is no language for 360. So
that's
first
of
all, did you come up with any new insights after doing this? But also, how did you mix both of them? In other words, how did you do one with its own cinema language and then the other one at the same time?
They're literally blended together in the experience, and the only way I really can make you understand it is to show it to you. And everyone says the same thing when they go, oh my God, I'm totally engaged. I'm following the story. I'm following it like I'm following a sim story. And yet I'm in the immersive environment and mise-en-scène of the film at the same time. So pivots back and forth between utilizing flatty language and immersive language within an immersive environment that's around you the whole time. So it's something that I think is very obvious to experiment with, but very little has been done in that area. So in terms of the insights, every day we have new insights in this, just playing with it. It's not like we know exactly what we're doing. We're definitely experimenting. And that's what I wanted to bring to it. I wanted to bring the indie film spirit to the immersive era. I really think there needs to be an immersive new wave that is like the French New Wave or the Japanese New Wave of cinema, the things that really push cinema forward in the 60s and 70s in a very unique way. And I think we need to bring that kind of energy to this medium now. And that's what I'm trying to do with these projects.
Let's talk a little bit about the production side of that. Did you move the camera? Did you have lights? Did you have equipment you had to get rid of?
We didn't move the camera much because this was, in terms of the 360 camera, I did move to 2D camera. It was a fully stylized set with the sky was a full projection dome. So that was a live projection the entire time. And there was a cyclorama that was a projection as well of a Hollywood landscape because it all takes place on a rooftop above Hollywood Boulevard. And it's kind of a Hollywood of the mind, as I like to say it about the film. It's a stylized theatrical environment with all these projection, which makes it very interesting to be in the context of this character drama where these young actors meet on this rooftop and share their lives and loves, successes and failures. And it's very much a comment on current Hollywood as well.
What was it like directing for 360 versus flat?
We use the eHalo camera, which has tremendous auto stitching in the cloud that Google provides with their jump program that comes with the camera.
That's 16 lenses, right? I think
16 around and we needed the one looking up because we had a dome sky. So yes, it was the perfect camera for it. And I basically had to put myself into a yoga position underneath the camera for every single take that we did with that camera. So I'm not a small guy, as you know, you met me.
Yes, you're not.
It was actually a physically challenging thing to do.
Sure.
But it was also amazing because my roots are in the theater. And it was like going back to those theatrical roots, just doing something in sort of the extreme reverse around.
Right.
theater in the round, except reversed.
Right.
So I was able to direct the actors that way and really check out the staging and what was going on, and it kept me very connected to the performances and to the story.
Are you using immersive audio to direct attention in that experience?
100%. And, this is dialogue-driven piece. It is not a piece that is about just directing the audience with certain audio cues. It's actually directing them with dialogue and with character.
Sure.
That is fully done in ambisonic immersive sound.
So you use ambisonic sound in production, so you record it, or did you lab everybody? Because I'm assuming you're not going to have boom mics. You can't. I mean, you would have to hide every single one of them.
So we labbed everybody.
So then you spatialize the audio in post.
100%. And we also had an ambisonic mic on the set as well to give us spatial information.
Oh, I see. But it was mainly for syncing and spatial information.
Correct. And then we also went out and recorded ambiances with the ambisonic mic.
Sure.
So we had full ambisonic ambiances, which is very important because this takes place on a Hollywood rooftop. You needed to have all the ambiances you would hear on that rooftop as part of the immersive environment of the film.
As a participant in your experience that you put out, is it 3DOF or is there agency? Is it 6DOF?
It is very much a viewer experience. Just trying to push how 360 and traditional cinema work together. And just that's enough to play with for me.
As a filmmaker, I do want to ask you this. What are your thoughts on 3DOF viewer versus 6DOF participant with agency? Do you see the future of VR going towards full 6 degrees of freedom? Or do you think there's always going to be a place for just being a viewer? I'm talking about specifically in VR.
I think both is going to happen. I think that you're going to have the ability to pivot to full 6DOF freedom and agency, but not necessarily all the time. I think there's a bit of a purist thing going on, trying to make everything fully interactive all the time. And there still needs to be guidance, in my view, that happens within the context of a virtual experience. And so I think we need to look at these things as part of the palette of the medium, not necessarily as the entire foundation of the medium.
So you feel 360 is not a step towards full VR. You feel 360 is just another tool set within VR that will always be here.
I think it's going to be a part of VR, but VR itself, or virtual experience, is evolving very much past 360 video, but 360 video will still be a component in what I call a world building process. My company, Studio Lightship, with my co-founder, Josh Shore, we are focused on creating a world building process that is incorporating this flexing tech stack that we have right now and really finding a process for doing world building that incorporates the true technological enablement that's here now, not based around the 1935 traditions of media production that still govern most of Hollywood production.
If you were to make a movie today about technology like you did back in the 90s, what would you tackle? Would it still be VR?
I would tackle, even to a greater degree, AI. I actually think AI is a bad term, artificial intelligence. There's nothing artificial about it. It's coming from us. I think of it as extended intelligence. And I also think we need to start telling positive stories about AI or EI, because if you say AI to anyone on the street, they're going to say Skynet. And yes, that's one potential outcome. But I believe that AI or EI can reflect the better angels of our nature as opposed to just the primal reptilian brainstem theater of Skynet. And I think that as storytellers, it's important and incumbent upon us to tell stories that incorporate a positive view as well.
I agree, because the reality of any technology, it can be used for bad things.
And VR is already being used for bad things. Absolutely.
Expand on that.
Well, I've consulted with certain governmental groups and I've found out things sometimes I wish I didn't know. There are VR torture environments being deployed.
No kidding.
Oh,
no
yeah.
kidding.
Oh, yeah.
Wow. That's something I would have never thought about.
Oh, yeah. And it can be worse than actual physical torture.
Sure, because you're playing with the mind.
Exactly. And so that kind of thing is going to happen. This is human reality. We have the shadow and the light.
Right.
So
we just need to have more light. That's all.
We need a little more light.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I agree. So what are your thoughts on AR?
AR is just an aspect on the continuum to virtual experience. I don't think of it as a separate thing from virtual experience. It's part of virtual experience. It's going to be utilized in concert with MR experiences environments. I think it's going to be something that popularizes it in a very unique way because of the fact that all the smart devices are enabled for it now. And I think it's going to be sort of an initial mass market adoption greater than most other things.
What do you see as the most exciting thing in VR coming up now?
Volumetric capture is changing as a technology almost every week. It's evolving very quickly. And at the core of world building is volumetric capture on a certain level. I'm very much excited about the evolving of that technology. And I'm seeing it both in the mainstream and also there's a lot of things happening under the radar that's pretty amazing right now. The great thing right now is that the technology that will enable this medium is actually all out there now. It's just about putting it together in the proper tech stack and process. And that is the focus I'm having right now because you have to get granular with that. You know, I'm going to applied scientist, not someone who is making technology. I'm utilizing it. So I'm very technology agnostic in many ways. I just want to use the best thing there is and the most efficient thing there is. And the thing that can actually help me convey the emotional engagement and the story and character that are at the core of what virtual experience needs to be about.
Well, Brett, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Before I let you go, I know you've got a very important meeting to go to, and I thank you for doing this, but you're in full control of virtual reality, just like in the movie. What would you do? Not what you think VR will be like in 5 years, but what would Brett do to VR?
I would utilize VR or virtual experience as a way of bringing humans together that activate the genius of the hive mind or the group mind. I believe a lot of the challenges we have need the activation of the group mind more than individual charismatic leadership in order for us to solve them. And I think that virtual experience and AI or EI, as I said, are part of that equation of activating the group mind genius that's out there. And I think it also can be tremendously fun, and we can have blissful experiences in the context of virtual reality. And that's what I would love to create.
That would be a fantastic future. I'd love to be part of that.
Great, man. Me too.
All right, Brett. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. I'm honored to have you here. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and thanks for your flexibility, and you're extremely reachable. So I really appreciate that.
No problem at all. It's been a great time to talk with you. Thank you.
If people want to get a hold of you, do you want to give your website, URL, or email, whatever you like?
I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram. At Director Leonard on Twitter. I'm easy to find.
Just search for Lawnmower Man Director and you'll find him.
Exactly. Brett Leonard. It's out there.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. Okay. All right, Brett, thank you so much. And thanks to the rest of you. Just a quick reminder, if you'd like to access all of our tutorials, podcast interviews, and more, remember to register for free at howtocreatevr.com. So until the next episode, I'm Marcelo Lewin. Cheers, everyone.